Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I am Keith R.A. DeCandido, here to do my readings. First of all, I want to thank all my subscribers. Since the last time I recorded one of these, I have passed 50 subscribers. Not a lot compared to some, but I still think it's cool that there's at least 50 people out there who want to hear me read. That's really cool. I have been writing fiction. I've been writing professionally since 1989, and I've been writing fiction since 1994, so that's, over 30 years now of writing professionally. And despite all the different things I have written about and written of and written in the worlds of and all sorts of other stuff, I'm probably still best known as somebody who writes about Star Trek, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Since 1999, I have written comic books and short stories and novels and novellas and articles and reviews and reference books all about Star Trek in all that time. So that's probably what I'm best known for, just because of the sheer volume of material I've written in that universe. So this time around, I'm going to read one of my Star Trek stories. Specifically, I'm going to read a Star Trek Voyager story. Currently, I am writing for Tor.com. I've done extensive rewatches of the original series, including both the original live-action series from the 1960s, the animated series from the 70s, and all the movies featuring Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and the gang. I also did a rewatch of Star Trek The Next Generation, including all 7 years of the TV show, as well as the follow-up movies, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and currently I am doing a rewatch of Star Trek Voyager. In addition, I've also been reviewing the new episodes of Star Trek that have been released by CBS All Access, Discovery, Short Treks, and Picard. And for Voyager, this year is the 25th anniversary of Voyager, which debuted in January of 1995. It inaugurated the United Paramount Network, aka UPN, which later in 2006 merged with the WB, which debuted the same month, to form the CW, because two new networks is apparently just a bit too much. Voyager was the flagship of UPN, and in 2005, which was 15 years ago, in celebration of the 10th anniversary of Star Trek Voyager, Simon & Schuster put together an anthology called Distant Shores, which celebrated the 10th anniversary of Voyager by stories that took place throughout the 7 years that Voyager was stuck in the Delta Quadrant. And my story actually did not take place in the Delta Quadrant or on Voyager, nor did it actually employ any of the main characters of Voyager. Instead, it was about the people left behind. It was actually inspired by an old MASH episode. There was an episode of MASH in which B.J. Honeycutt and his wife organized a party for the people left behind at home. Hawkeye's father, BJ's wife, Margaret's parents, Potter's wife, Father Mulcahy's sister, Klinger's mother, Radar's mother, all getting together at a hotel in New York for dinner to celebrate. And that inspired me to do a story about the people that Voyager left behind. Janeway's boyfriend, Mark Johnson, who we saw in the very first episode in Caretaker. Janeway left her dog with him. And there's also Tom Paris's father. There's Tuvok's wife and children. There's various other people. Harry Kim's parents. Samantha Wildman's husband, who was assigned to Deep Space Nine. And also the families of the people who died in Caretaker. There were a whole bunch of people who were killed when Voyager first fell through the Caretaker's array, including the ship's first officer, Aaron Cavett, the ship's con officer, Stoddy, the chief medical officer, who never even got a name, the chief engineer, who never got a name or a face. There are all these people who were lost, and nobody knew what happened to them until the 6th season of the show, when they were able to finally contact the Alpha Quadrant. Anyway, all this is by way of saying what I wanted to do is a story that focused on those left behind. So, without further ado, here is Letting Go by Keith R.A. DeCandido from Star Trek Voyager, Distant Shores. Mark Johnson prepared for the onslaught of Irish Ser. Sure enough, Molly leapt up at him as soon as the door slid open, front paws on his chest, barking enthusiastically, and generally treating Mark's arrival home as an event worthy of commemorating with several licks of his chin. Giving her a big scritch behind the ears, Mark smiled. Molly's ritual greeting was about the only thing that got a smile out of him these days. When Molly first calmed down enough to get back down on all fours, he entered the house. Molly ran circles around him as he stepped into the living room, dropping his duffel bag unceremoniously on the red wool rug that took up most of the living room floor. There were items in the bag from work that he knew he had to deal with, but he didn't have the wherewithal to do so. He looked up on the display on the wall that showed the date and time. 11 months. Today is the 11-month anniversary. In 1 month, it'll be a year. The couch sat in the room, staring at him dolefully, which was, Mark thought, a neat trick for a piece of furniture. That was the couch he was sitting on the last time he talked to Kath. Mark, you've got to take her home with you. Kath's face was pleading with him at the news that Molly was pregnant. Unable to resist teasing her, Mark protested. With me? I just got the rugs cleaned. She's with child. I can't leave her in a kennel while I'm... Is this another love me, love my dog demand? It wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation, after all. Yes, she said matter-of-factly. He shook his head. How could I ever refuse you? Thanks, honey. And she meant it, he could tell. When do you leave? As soon as I approve these system status reports. Ah, the exciting life of a starship captain. All right, I won't bother you anymore. At that, she looked up and put her hand to the viewer, as if trying to touch his face. Hey, you never bother me, except the way I love to be bothered. Understand? He smirked. Aye, Captain. See you in a few weeks. Oh, and Mark, go by my house and pick up the doggy bed. She'll be more comfortable. He let the other shoe drop. I already did, an hour ago. That was the last he'd heard from her. Mark's eyes went over to the doggy bed in question, looking like nothing but a huge wicker basket with a flannel blanket covered in Irish setter hair draped over it. But Molly loved it. The couch was also where he was sitting when he got a message 2 days later from Deep Space Nine, the very same space station where Voyager had been docked. A dark-skinned man with close-cropped hair and a serious demeanor appeared on the screen. He wore a Starfleet uniform, just like Kath's, except he only had 3 pips. If he remembered right, that meant he was a commander. Mr. Johnson, my name is Benjamin Sisko. I'm afraid I have some bad news. Sisko told him that Voyager had apparently disappeared in the Badlands, just like the ship they were going to the Badlands to find, and that search and rescue operations were underway. And any number of other things that Mark could no longer remember. Mark did recall that Sisko was very kind and full of empathy. So much so that Mark suspected he had gotten a message or two like that of his own in his day. Mark had been unable to bring himself to sit on the couch since then. Within 2 months of Kath's disappearance, Molly had had her puppies, and Mark had found homes for all of them. Although it wasn't intentional, placing the puppies was made easier by what Mark was going through. People were more than happy to take a new pet out of sympathy. Nobody had found any debris, so Starfleet had yet to declare the Voyager crew actually dead. But there was no sign of the ship either. Looking down at the floor, Mark saw that the setter had completed the ritual jumping, licking, and running around in circles. She now padded over to the doggy bed, plopped herself down onto it, folding her front paws in front of herself, and plunking her head down on those paws, looking at Mark with her friendly eyes. I don't know what to do. He'd continued going to work, but his heart wasn't in it. Ramiro, Holland, and Taisha, the other botanists in his section, were covering for him, but they wouldn't do that forever. Sooner or later, he'd have to get on with his life. Normally, when he was in such a state, he'd turn to Kath for advice. They'd been friends for years before they became lovers, and he could barely remember a time when she wasn't around to give good advice. Or, more often, a kick in the tuchus whenever he moped around. That was what attracted him to her in the first place. The combined noise of the comm unit on the coffee table beeping, and Molly barking in response to it, snapped Mark out of his reverie. To his embarrassment, he had been standing in the middle of the living room, just staring into space for at least a full minute. Shaking his head, he walked over to the coffee table, standing on the opposite side of it from the couch, and activated the viewer, even as Molly wandered over to see what all the fuss was. The display indicated that the message was from Deep Space Nine. However, the Starfleet officer on the screen wasn't the human Sisko, but rather a Qatarian man Mark didn't know. He had only one pip, which meant he was fairly low-ranking. What's this about? Hello? Mark said. Greetings. Is this Mark Johnson? The Qatarian had a soft voice and spoke in a very hesitant tone, as if not entirely confident he'd chosen the right words to use. Yes, it is. And you are? My name is Ensign Grisgrendrick. You don't know me, of course, Mr. Johnson, but you and I, we have something in common. Okay. Mark had no idea where this was going. The Qatarian hesitated. My wife is Ensign Samantha Wildman. Mark blinked. The ensign had spoken as if that name should mean something to Mark, but aside from Kath and one or two officers, others she knew through her, he didn't know anybody in Starfleet. That name certainly didn't ring any bells. All right. I'm afraid I don't know. Shaking his head, the ensign let out a small laugh. Of course you don't. I'm a fool. My apologies, Mr. Johnson. I had just assumed that you would... Samantha serves on the Voyager. Mark's face fell. Oh, God, sir, I'm so sorry. I'm afraid the only member of Kath's crew I really know is Tuvok. Perfectly understandable, Mr. Johnson. In any case, the reason why I've contacted you is quite simple. As I'm sure you're aware, the 1-year anniversary of the Voyager's disappearance is approaching. I have been contacting the families of the crew in the hopes of gathering all of us here on Deep Space Nine. Mark's first instinct was to reject the notion out of hand. He'd been spending 11 months wallowing. The last thing he wanted to do was get together with a bunch of other people who were doing the same. But then he thought for a moment. Maybe this is just what I need. Maybe being around other people who are going through what I'm going through will help. Because the fact of the matter was, beyond taking Molly's offspring, nobody had really been able to help. Most of his friends and colleagues were other scientists, and his family, although they liked Kath just fine, never really understood the whole Starfleet thing. They lived happy, safe lives that usually didn't involve armed ships going into plasma storms and disappearing. And so, after only a few moments' hesitation, he said, I think that's a wonderful idea, Ensign, again, the short laugh. You may call me Gress, simply, Mr. Johnson. It is usually the best that human tongues can do with my name. His tone grew more wistful. Samantha was the only human who was ever able to pronounce it properly. Of course, and please, call me Mark. Very well, Mark. They quickly worked out the specifics. Gress promised to have quarters arranged on the station, and then he signed off. Deactivating the viewer, Mark reached down and gave Molly a little scritch behind the ear. That got her to raise her head. She was always willing to make it easier for Mark to scritch her. To his delight, Mark found himself looking forward to something for the first time in 11 months, actually. Mark stood, facing a difficult decision. Do I go for the meat, the fish, the fruit, or the vegetables? Before him was laid out an impressive display of delicacies, most of them apparently Bajoran. Since Deep Space Nine was technically a Bajoran station, though Starfleet administered it, the choice of foodstuffs made sense. Mark had arrived late. The transport he took had several delays, so the gathering was in full swing when he arrived. The attendees were a wide range of people, some Starfleet, some not. A small group stood quietly next to the window. Mark noticed that they all had deep black eyes and deduced that, since they were not speaking, yet all stared at each other attentively, and since one of Kath's bridge crew was a betazoid named Stadi, these were her family. A group of about half a dozen Vulcan civilians all gathered around in one corner. Mark had recognized one of them as Tuvok's wife, T'Pel, and the young man next to her. My God, he had realized with a start, that's sick! The boy had grown quite a bit since Mark had last seen him. T'Pel had given him a brief nod when he had come in before returning to her conversation. A Ferengi was flitting about the place, holding a tray of drinks, making sure everyone was happy and comfortable. He had steered Mark toward the hors d'oeuvres table and encouraged him to sample everything. Having trouble deciding? A voice asked next to him. Mark turned to see a woman in a Starfleet uniform. It was just like Sisko's, so he figured she was also a commander. She had olive skin, a huge mane of brown hair hanging loose about her shoulders, a thin face, and a disproportionately wide mouth. In response to her question, he said, "Actually, yeah. Decision-making was never my strong suit. I usually need about 3 weeks' notice." He thought wistfully Kath was always the big decision-maker. "Well, I recommend the kava fruit." "Which one's that?" Mark asked, peering at the part of the table that had the fruit. The woman pointed at the bowl in the upper right-hand corner. "That." "Okay." Grabbing a toothpick, Mark speared 2 slices of the pale fruit and popped them into his mouth. The fruit was quite watery, with a soft texture, and a taste that reminded him at once of both cantaloupe and oranges, but with an oddly salty aftertaste. "This tastes very confusing." Laughing at that, the woman offered her hand. "Dina Voyaskunsky." "Mark Johnson," he said, returning the handshake. She squinted. "Okay, you're too young to have a child on Voyager, so you've got to have either a spouse or a parent." Mark grinned. "We haven't made it to the spouse stage yet. I've been with Captain Janeway, for a while now. In fact, we're not even at the living together stage. Though we are at the I'll keep an eye on your dog while you go to the Badlands stage." "Well, that puts you one up on me." Dina shook her head and grabbed one of the vegetables. "Kind of fitting we met, actually. I'm sorta kinda with Janeway's first officer, Aaron Cabot." "Sorta kinda?" Still holding the vegetable, she said, "We weren't even at the dog swapping stage yet. In fact, until a year ago, we weren't even at the speaking stage to each other's stage. We had a thing a few years back, but it went sour. Then we crossed paths again on a mission, and we decided to get back together after he went with Voyager on a trip to the Badlands." Ouch. Mark winced. "Yeah. Honestly, I didn't even know about this little shindig until the hood docked for repairs, and I heard about it at Quark's. Gress was kind enough to let me come along. Are you enjoying yourself?" Dina paused to eat the vegetable before finally answering. "Not really. Honestly, I don't know what Aaron was doing for all the years between when we broke up and when I saw him last year. The whole point of getting together was to try to catch up." "I'm afraid I don't really know him. I mean, Kath told me about him, said he was a good, solid officer, make a fine XO, but that was pretty much it." "Yeah, that sounds like Aaron." A short, pale man in a Starfleet uniform and a tall, dark woman in civilian clothes approached the table. The man, who seemed to be about 30, was speaking. "Weird thing is the Tetrion emissions they detected." The tall woman let out a breath. "Davy." Mark recognized her tone, as it was the same one Mark himself used with Kath whenever words like Tetrion or strange abbreviations like ODN or EPS entered the conversation. To be fair, she also used it on him whenever he went off on a botany rant. "Sorry, Davy looked up at Mark and Dina. Hi. Davy Honingsberg. Mark Johnson." He indicated Dina. "This is Dina Voyaskunsky. We're with the captain and first officer." The woman smiled, though Mark noted that the smile didn't quite reach her brown eyes. "Abaya Perek. We're both with engineers. Davy's father is Alexander Honingsberg, the chief engineer, and my husband is Joe Carey, Alex's assistant." Davy was picking through the meats while he spoke. "I was just telling Abaya that there's a really good chance that they're okay. You see, there wasn't any debris. They didn't find any at all. And while it's true that sometimes the plasma storms are bad enough that they won't leave any debris, I've been studying the patterns in the Badlands, and there weren't any storms in that area big enough to do that kind of damage to a ship Voyager size on the day they disappeared. Besides, there's the Tetrion emissions." Mark smiled. "I'm afraid I'm in the same boat as Abaya. I don't know what that means." Dina said, "It means there's something was in the Badlands that shouldn't have been there. Tetrions aren't found naturally there." Abaya gave Davy, now stuffing several bits of reddish-blue meat into his mouth, a mildly reproving look. "Now see, Davy, if you'd just said that in the first place, I probably would have understood quite a bit more of what you were saying." She looked at Mark and Dina. "Davy's like his father, and my Joe. They talk in jargon constantly. Drove me crazy whenever Davy or Alex visited." Mark covered his urge to laugh out loud by eating more of the kava fruit. Alexander Honingsberg had been a thorn in Kath's side for most of the shakedown cruise. Apparently, he didn't like to give detailed reports, saying that the captain should just trust him. Mark had laughed when Kath told him that, prompting Kath to give him one of her penetrating stares. But soon she laughed too, knowing as he did that she didn't take that sort of thing from subordinates. However, Mark figured it wouldn't be politic to mention that to the engineer's son. Instead, he said, "So, you're in Starfleet also, I see." "Yeah, just enlisted, though. I'm with the SCE. My term's up in a month, and I doubt I'm going to re-up." Abaya turned to Davy in surprise. "You're not re-enlisting? This is the first you've told me. Why not?" "Because I don't think Starfleet's doing enough. Dad's out there, and we need to find him. Starfleet's just given up, if you ask me." "Starfleet doesn't give up on people," Dina said in a tight voice. "If Voyager's out there, Starfleet will find them." Davy shook his head. "I hope you're right, Commander." With that, he turned on his heel and walked off. Abaya looked at both of them with an apologetic expression. "Truly, I'm sorry. Davy's always been a bit high-strung, and, well..." "He's not taking this well?" Mark prompted. "Are any of us?" Abaya shook her head. "I'm just glad I left the kids home." "Kids?" Mark winced. All Kath left behind was a pregnant dog. Tuvok also had children, of course, and apparently so did Joe Carey. He wondered how many others on Voyager were in that boat. "Yes, 2 boys, Devraj and Michael." Abaya, Mark, and Dina talked for a bit longer. Then Mark decided to start mingling. Kath had given him a vague précis of the crew, and he wanted to place family to those descriptions. He spoke for a bit with 2 elderly humans whose son, Harry Kim, was Kath's ops officer. Mark told them that Kath spoke very highly of Harry, although she hadn't actually met him when last they spoke. Still, she had been impressed with the young man's service record. In addition, he spoke to Emmett Rollins, whose brother was a bridge officer, and a Bolian named Epp, whose relationship with one of the science officers was still unclear to Mark even after Epp explained it. He exchanged brief pleasantries with T'Pel and Sek, if the word pleasantries could apply to conversations with Vulcans, and was introduced to the father and brother of Taral, the ship's nurse, and the fiancé and parents of Vorik, one of the ship's engineers. Mark knew nothing about Taral. She had come along with the ship's doctor, whose name Mark couldn't even remember. But he was able to say to Kath that Kath thought very highly of Vorik. In fact, he said, she was very lucky to have him on board. Vorik's fiancé, a slight woman named Selmar, raised an eyebrow and said, "It is very unlikely that chance factors had much to do with Vorik's posting to Captain Janeway's vessel. However, it is understandable that the captain herself would express it in such terms, and her respect for my bonded one's abilities is appreciated." Mark supposed that was the closest he'd get to a thank you from her. At one point, Mark noticed that there was a Starfleet admiral, an older human, standing apart from everyone else. He looked about 1,000,000 parsecs away and wasn't talking to anyone, not even the other Starfleet people. Mark wandered over to where Dina was standing and talking to a couple who introduced themselves as Renee Delaney and Asano Takahashi. They had 2 daughters, both serving on Voyager, and asked if she knew who that was. "That's Owen Paris," Dina said with a certain amount of reverence. Mark could understand why. Although he'd never met the Admiral, Kath had certainly spoken enough about him. Renee almost dropped her drink. "The Owen Paris? How's he connected to Voyager?" "I'm not sure, to be honest," Dina said. "I am," Mark said, taking a sip of a thick drink that the Ferengi said was called Kanar. "He was Kath's mentor early in her career, and she served with him on the Al-Batani. I should go say hi. Excuse me." Renee and Asano both inclined their heads, and Asano said, "Of course." "Mind if I tag along?" Dina asked. "I've always wanted to meet him." Mark shrugged. "Sure." Admiral Paris was a large, imposing man with thinning white hair, a round nose, and looked like he was carrying the weight of several worlds on his shoulders. "Excuse me, Admiral Paris?" Paris blinked twice and looked at Mark as if not sure who or what he was. "Oh, yes, what can I do for you?" Offering his hand, he said, "I just wanted to introduce myself, sir. My name's Mark Johnson. I'm..." Returning the handshake, Paris smiled, although like Abaya's, it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, you're Catherine's beau. It's a pleasure, Mr. Johnson. Catherine talked about you often." Mark chuckled. "All nice things, I hope. This is Commander Dina Voyskunsky." She shook his hand as well. "It's an honor, sir." Paris frowned. "Voyskunsky, I know that name. The Hood, right? You work with Bob DeSoto." Dina's eyes widened, apparently thrilled to be recognized. "Yes, sir. I've been Captain DeSoto's first officer for a little over 2 years now." "I'm surprised to see you, sir," Mark said. "I mean, it's good of you to be here for Kath." Paris shook his head. It's not just for Catherine. My son was on Voyager. That surprised Mark. I didn't know. You couldn't have. His involvement in the mission was classified. Technically, I shouldn't be telling you about it, but it's been a year and it just... Paris got a faraway look in his eyes, then muttered, "Excuse me," and left the room. Mark stared after him. Well, that was weird. Dina snorted. Weirder than you think. His son was a Starfleet washout. Actually, he was worse than that. He caused an accident, got some people killed, and then lied about it. He came forward eventually and got cashiered out. Last I heard, he'd been arrested working for the Maquis. Dina shook her head. I wouldn't be surprised if the Admiral pulled some strings to get the kid to help Janeway out when she went out on her little Maquis hunt. That's probably why he's so wrecked. Mark nodded. Probably. Dina wandered off, and then Davy walked up to Mark. He was passing a piece of meat back and forth from one hand to the other without actually eating it. Excuse me, Mr. Johnson, right? Mark is fine. Right. Look, I'm sorry if I was rude back there. I've just been very agitated. I know Dad's okay out there. I just know it. I mean, Voyager was built specifically to withstand the plasma storms. It can't just be destroyed without any kind of trace like that, especially with the Tetryon emissions. Before Mark could reply, Gress spoke at as loud a volume as his soft voice would allow. May I have everyone's attention, please? The Katarian stood in the middle of the room, holding a glass of what looked to Mark like Saurian brandy, and had to repeat his request several times before the room quieted down. I would like to thank all of you for coming. I would also like to thank Quark for his fine catering job. The Ferengi bowed slightly. Gress continued. The pain of separation from our loved ones, of not knowing their true fate, is a difficult one that we have all had to bear. Today, for the first time in a year, that pain is lessened a bit for being able to share it with all of you. I felt very much alone this last year without my dear Samantha, but today I feel a good deal less lonely. I also convey a message from Captain Sisko, who could not be here today. Mark blinked in surprise, both at the message and at Sisko's apparent promotion. Gress went on. He wanted me to reassure all of you that Starfleet has not given up on the search and has not given up on the Voyager, and that they will do everything in their power to find our families and friends and return them to us. Mark raised his glass. Hear, hear! Several others in the room, including Davy next to him, repeated that. Mark, I'd like you to meet Carla. Mark looked up from his workstation in surprise. He hadn't heard Ramiro come into his office. He'd been so engrossed in the annual report that he probably wouldn't have noticed if the sun went nova. What was that? Then he registered that there was someone else with Ramiro, and she was named Carla. Hi, Mark, I'm Carla. Ramiro laughed. And the sad thing is, Carla here is one of the finest minds on the project. He stood up from his workstation, rubbing his eyes free of the sand that really should not have been there in mid-afternoon. I'm sorry, Carla. I've been caught up in this annual report, and it has to be perfect, or... I know, she said. I'm here to help implement the new phase of Taisha Mifflin's project. It took Mark a moment to process this. Wait, she's a molecular biologist? Nah, she said. I'm just a janitor, but I lie real well on my resume. For the first time, Mark noticed that she had a dazzling smile. Then he noticed the rest of her. Her porcelain skin, her blonde hair, her sky-blue eyes, her perfect cheekbones. And he decided that she was quite possibly the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in her life. Patiently, Ramiro said, Mark, I said at the last staff meeting that we were going to bring in a molecular biologist regardless of whether or not we got the go-ahead on Taisha's project. I forget, was that the meeting I was late for, the meeting I missed, or the meeting I slept through? Ramiro sighed. It was the meeting where I told you didn't have to kill yourself writing the report because we were going to bring in a molecular biologist regardless of what happened with the project. I remember now. Really? Now it was Mark's turn to sigh. No, but I'm perfectly willing to take your word for it that you said it in my presence. Good enough. She won't be starting until Monday. Try to sleep sometime between now and then. If you really feel I must. I do. Ramiro led Carla toward his office door. Come on, Carla. I'll introduce you to the coherent people on the team. Okay. Carla then hit Mark with another of those dazzling smiles. "It was good to meet you, Carla." Mark chuckled. "Same here, Mark." After they left, Mark looked down at the words on the screen of his workstation, which he had theoretically written, and were just as theoretically coherent. Well, all the words are English, I'll say that much. I've got to take a break from this. Unfortunately, work had been the only thing keeping him going these past 9 months. The gathering on Deep Space Nine had done little to alleviate his worries about Kath. In fact, in a lot of ways, it made it worse, because now he wasn't just worried about her, but the entire crew. So instead of being a zombie at work, he decided to throw himself into everything, including the hybridization project that Taisha had put forward. Obviously, I've gone too far in the other direction. Then his comm unit beeped. Activating it, he said, "Johnson." Dina Voyskunsky's face appeared on the screen. "Surprise!" Mark blinked. "Dina! Wasn't expecting to hear from you." Dina was one of 2 people Mark met at the DS9 gathering that he stayed in touch with, the other being Davy Honingsberg. The former was because he genuinely enjoyed her company, the latter more because he worried about the engineer. As promised, Davy had ended his time with the Starfleet Corps of Engineers, and now dedicated every moment to trying to find out what had happened to Voyager. He'd even hired a ship to take him to the Badlands so he could scan them himself. Davy read every report he could get his hands on, not just from Starfleet, but from Federation civilian reports, as well as those of Bajorans, Cardassians, and Klingons, the latter being a neat trick, since the Klingons had pulled out of the Khitomer Accords. He was determined both that Starfleet wasn't doing enough, and that he himself could learn the truth. Dina said, "We got into it with some Klingons last week, so we had to come back for some repairs and restaffing. I figured since I was in town, as it were, we could catch up in person instead of over subspace. You free tonight?" He smiled. "Actually, it's a funny coincidence. I'm having lunch with Davy Honingsberg tomorrow. Want to join us?" Dina shook her head. "Can't. I'm getting together with my aunt in Estonia tomorrow, and then we're shipping out Sunday. Besides, Honingsberg gives me the creeps." Mark found he couldn't argue with that. "All right, then how about dinner tonight?" "Okay, I know just the place. Captain Sisko recommended it when we were on DS9. That night, Mark sat in a lovely restaurant in New Orleans called Sisko's, owned and operated by the station commander's father, eating the best gumbo he'd ever had. Dina was eating crawfish and telling him all about what the Hood had been doing during the past 9 months. "The Klingons are getting to be a real problem. They're scary enough when we're their allies, but it's really no fun to be on their bad side." She chewed some crawfish and then swallowed a great deal of water. "So what about you?" "Well, I've been kind of throwing myself into work. We're trying to get a new project started, but whether or not it flies depends on our annual report, which I'm writing." He told her about the project, trying not to get too bogged down in botanical technobabble, and then he told her about Carla. "She sounds nice." "Yeah, and she probably convinced him a complete imbecile." "You should ask her out." Mark almost choked on his gumbo. "What? Are you nuts? First of all, I made quite possibly the worst first impression in the history of the human race. And second of all, Kath is missing," Dina said sharply. "And she's been missing for almost 2 years now. And she'll probably stay missing, assuming she isn't dead." "Dina..." Mark couldn't form words beyond that. It was as if Dina had kicked him in the stomach. "Listen to me, Mark," she said. "I just came out of a firefight with 2 Klingon birds of prey that we almost didn't make it out of alive. 15 people, including our operations officer, didn't make it out alive." "I'm sorry," Mark said softly. "Thank you, but the point is, life's too short. I spent way too long moping over Aaron and wondering what might have been and wishing I could have gotten together with him one last time before Voyager went poof. But I didn't, and we're fighting Klingons, and the Dominion is still a threat, and the Cardassians are falling to pieces, and the Borg could come back at any moment, and I can't waste any time worrying about what might have been, and neither can you. Ask this Carla person out. Live a little." Mark thought over her words as he ate more gumbo. "Okay, fine. Maybe you're right, but that doesn't address the crappy first impression part of my problem." Dina had the widest smile Mark had ever seen, and she favored him with one now. Don't worry. Most women would think that was cute." "Really? Okay, I would, but I'm weird." "Got that right," Mark muttered. "I heard that," she laughed. "You also walked right into it." He sighed. "I promise to think about it, okay?" "Fair enough." She ate the last of her fish. "Hey, speaking of not getting on with your life, how's Honingsberg doing?" Mark shook his head in dismay. He canceled our lunch. He said he had to go off-planet to investigate another theory. Theory about what? Then she slammed her fork down. What, about finding Voyager? I don't believe this. Starfleet has done... Mark held up a hand. I know, but tell him that. I've been trying to convince him that if Starfleet can't find anything, and he isn't likely to, but half the time when I talk to him, I don't think he entirely registers that I'm there. The next day, Mark got 2 messages. One was from Kath's mother, Gretchen, checking up on him and wishing him well. She contacted him periodically to see how he was doing. She hadn't been able to make Gress's get-together on DS9, but she had been grateful to hear Mark's report of it. Speaking of whom, Gress had the other message. He was back on Qatar, having taken a 6-month leave of absence. The worry about my Samantha has affected my work, he said. However, I feel it is important to commemorate the 2nd anniversary, and so I am inviting everyone from the first one. Will you please join me, Mark? Mark decided to go. Maybe it'll help me more move on like I obviously need to. 3 months later, he was in a large house on Qatar with Gress, Davy, T'Pel, Abaya, the Kim family, and a few others. Absent were the families of Taral and Vorik. According to T'Pel, Selmar married another man 3 months earlier. Dina, Admiral Paris, Stadi's family, Emmett Rollins, and most of the rest of the people who were on DS9. Most of them told me, Gress said when Mark commented on this, that they have moved on with their lives. For myself, I cannot do that. I just know that my Samantha is out there somewhere, waiting for me. He let out a sigh. We were planning to have a baby, you know. We had been seeing Dr. Bashir on Deep Space Nine to make sure we were compatible, and then... He trailed off. Finally, Abaya spoke up. I wish I had your confidence. It just gets so hard. Michael and Devraj don't even ask where Daddy is anymore. I can't imagine that they wouldn't try to let us know if they were alive. Davy said, they wouldn't have if they weren't able to. It's possible that they got sent very far away. Mark looked at Davy with a certain amount of distress. It had been months since Mark had last seen him, and it looked like Davy hadn't eaten since then. Already pale, he now looked almost as white as a Borg drone. He hadn't shaved in a few days, and Mark feared he would have been able to make out his ribcage in detail if he took his shirt off. He was so skinny. What do you mean? Taking a quick drink of his Altair water, Davy said, there's this monograph that a Cardassian scientist published about tetrions that they could be used for an intergalactic transporter. You just need to provide the right power source. Now, the Badlands, they'd make a great power source. And that would also explain why the storms were so weak in that area during that time. If someone built that intergalactic transporter and designed it to draw power from the area around it, then it could be used to send ships to another galaxy. The room was quiet for a moment. Finally, Mark said slowly, Davy, don't you think that's a little far-fetched? Honestly, I thought so at first, but if you think about it, it fits. It explains the tetrions, the low-energy storms, why there was no debris, and why we haven't heard from them. Gress shook his head. I hope you are right, my friend. Well, that's all well and good, Abaya said, but what if you're wrong? What if they really were destroyed and we've been hanging on like idiots for 2 years? I don't think it's that idiotic to think that my father's still alive, Davy said tersely. I agree with Mr. Honingsberg, T'Pel said. I believe that my husband is alive. Many times over the years, he has gone on difficult missions, and he has always returned to me. I choose to have faith in his ability to do so again. It is not logical, but the feeling remains, and it will be the height of illogic to deny its existence. Smiling wanly, Gress raised his glass and said, and I propose a toast to the height of illogic. Long may it sustain us. Someone else said, hear, hear. This time, though, Mark couldn't bring himself to say it. Mark stared at Carla from across the lunch table. Ramiro, Holland, Carla, and Taisha were carrying on about current events. So, Cardassians part of the Dominion now. That's what they said on FNS. I don't get it. I mean, why would the Cardassians do that? Who the hell knows? But it looks like we're allied with the Klingons again. Oh, sure. Now we're all friends again. Bastards. Mark found himself fascinated with the way Carla chewed her food. His own food, though, remained untouched. I'm just wondering how President Zeif is going to react. God, you don't think there'll be martial law again, do you? Nah, Zeif wouldn't do that. Jarish Inyo, he ain't. Yeah, well, I didn't think Jarish Inyo would do it either, and he did. And promptly got voted the hell out of office, and good riddance to him. Zeif I trust. What worries me is having Jem'Hadar this close. I hear they can change shape. No, that's the founders. The Jem'Hadars are just nasty-ass soldiers. You sure? I could swear that they were shape changers. Nope, ask Mark. His girlfriend's in Starfleet. Suddenly, Mark realized that everyone was looking at him, expectantly. What? Was all he could manage to say as he thought. What the hell am I doing? Staring at Carla like some kind of lovesick teenager? What would Kath say if she found out? Which then prompted the thought, how the hell is Kath going to find out? Isn't your girlfriend in Starfleet? Ramiro hit Holland on the arm. You jackass. Holland winced and said, oh, damn, I'm sorry, Mark. I just forgot. It's okay. You have a girlfriend? Carla asked. Yeah, sort of. Carla smiled impishly. Sort of, huh? That sounds like most relationships with Starfleet people. Mark shifted in his seat. Not exactly. I mean, we don't... He took a deep breath. Kath's captain and her ship went missing over 2 years ago. Carla's face fell. Oh, God, Mark, I'm so sorry. Waving it off, Mark said, that's all right. You couldn't know. It's not something I talk about all that much. Shooting Holland a look, he said, I guess I should more often. I really am sorry, Mark, Holland said emphatically. That's okay. Mark got up, not having eaten any of his lunch. I need to get back to work. He headed out toward his office. A voice sounded out from behind him. Hey, Carla. Smiling, he turned around and looked at Carla. Yes, Mark? I wanted to apologize again. She hesitated, which surprised Mark, as the impression she'd created over the 4 months since she joined the project was of someone who was completely forthright. Just what? She took a breath. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Just say the word. With that, she turned and walked back toward her own office. Mark stared after her for several seconds before finally retreating to his own workspace, completely confused about his own feelings. Mark went home that night to be greeted first by Molly and then by the sound of the house computer. You have 4 messages. Scritching Molly behind the ear, which got her to stop running in circles around him, Mark said, Who from? 1 official message from Starfleet Command. 3 personal messages, 1 from Gretchen Janeway, 1 from Commander Dina Voyskunsky, 1 from David Alexander Honigsberg. Bile started to rise in Mark's throat. His stomach felt like someone was going at him with a phaser drill. 4 messages, all of them connected in some way to Starfleet and Voyager. It was, of course, perfectly possible that it was good news, but Mark knew that was a forlorn hope. Computer, he hesitated. What do I listen to first? He wondered as he walked over to the coffee table. Then, play messages in order of arrival. He activated the viewer, and the Starfleet logo appeared, which meant that it was either the official message or Dina. When the logo was replaced by the image of Owen Paris, the phaser drill went on overload. Mark, I hope this message finds you well. Normally you'd be informed of this by someone else. This isn't really under my purview, but I thought it was important that I be the one to tell the families, especially after seeing you all at DS9. The Admiral looked away for a moment, then looked back at the viewer with a steady gaze. Starship Voyager has officially been declared missing and presumed destroyed. The search has been exhaustive, but nothing has turned up. And now, with the Dominion having a foothold in the Alpha Quadrant, and with Starfleet still recovering from the Borg attack, and the trail being 2.5 years old, the resources simply aren't there. And the truth of the matter is that there likely isn't anything to find. I'm sorry, Mark. I know how much you and Catherine meant to each other. Mark's legs felt like dead weights. For the first time in over 2 years, he sat on the couch. The computer, having received no instructions to the contrary, moved on to the next message. The one from Kath's mother went on for several minutes about how ridiculous it was, and how could Starfleet do that, and back when her late husband Edward was in Starfleet, they didn't give up on people, but the Dominion and the Borg had everyone in a tizzy. Mark barely paid attention to that, or to the one from Dina, which was much shorter, and mostly was a condolence call. Davy Honigsberg's ragged voice, however, broke him out of the half-reverie he was in. Can you believe those bastards? They're not just missing and presumed dead, they're missing, and we can find them! I just got back from Bajor, and I found out something interesting. That Cardassian's theories were completely trashed, but I think a lot of that was political because of the whole Dominion thing. I've been studying it, and yeah, he was wrong about the intergalactic transporter, but that's because of that political crap. They're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I think he's on the right track. He just went too big with it. I think it might have been a shorter range transporter, something that could send them a few thousand light years. That would still explain the lack of debris and why we haven't heard anything. Frowning, Mark turned the viewer back around toward the couch so he could see the image. What he saw scared the living daylights out of him. Mark didn't think it was possible for someone to look worse than Davy did on Qatar, but he did. He lost even more weight. His eyes had more red than brown, and his hair was longer, uncombed, and looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Anyhow, I just want to let you know that I haven't given up on Dad yet. Talk to you later. Mark frowned. Computer, return message to Davy Honigsberg. The following Saturday, Mark sat in Felinity, a Cation restaurant in downtown Toronto. It was around the corner from Davy's home, so Mark figured he'd have an easier time tearing himself away to turn up. Davy was late, of course, but that didn't surprise Mark. This was the 5th time they had actually managed to make a lunch date since they met on DS9, and Davy had yet to show up on time for any of them. Mark had hoped that the proximity to his apartment might aid in his punctuality, but that was, he had to admit, a small hope. While he waited, he rehearsed the speech he was going to give Davy about how he needed to let go of this obsession with finding his father, and how he was killing himself, and how he needed to get on with his life. Basically the same speech that Dina had hit him with in New Orleans. Right, and then he can look at you with those bloodshot eyes and ask why the hell you haven't done the same. Why the hell haven't I? He sighed. Because every time you come home and brace yourself at the doorway, it's not Molly you're expecting to leap at you. It's Kath. After an hour had passed, Mark started to worry. Davy was never this late. He rose from his table and decided to go to the apartment and drag Davy out kicking and screaming if he had to. When he got to the modest walk-up and rang the door chime, he went through the speech again in his head. Maybe I can convince myself, if not him. There was no answer. He rang the chime again. Nothing. Davy, you in there? Still nothing. The door wouldn't open unless someone inside acknowledged the chime, so Mark wasn't sure what to do. He was about to head back downstairs to use a public comm terminal in the hopes that Davy would answer that at least, when he heard a low moan from the other side of the door. Apparently, that was enough for the computer that operated the door as it slid obligingly open. The first thing Mark noticed was the smell. The air was stale, and dust seemed to choke the air. Pads were strewn about the floor and the furniture, and the latter was also caked with dirt and stains and dust. Then he saw Davy lying face down on the floor, drool puddled near his mouth. Oh no. Mark ran over to kneel by Davy's prone form, and immediately moved to check for a pulse. Except he had no idea where to check. He knew it was on the neck, somewhere. Then he noted that Davy was breathing, albeit shallowly. Standing back up so quickly it made his head spin for a moment, he looked around the room for the comm terminal. After a moment, he found it, amid half a dozen pads and 3 glasses that had dried up liquid stains in them. He immediately put in a call to the nearest hospital. When he went to work the following Monday, he headed straight to Carla's office. She looked up from her desk when he came in. Hey, Mark, what's... Oh, man, you look like hell. He grinned raggedly. So kind of you to notice. I had a bit of a rough weekend. A friend of mine missed a lunch date. I went to his house and found him collapsed on the floor. Turns out he was malnourished. If he'd actually shown up for lunch, it would have been his first meal in weeks. That's terrible. Yeah, I met him a couple years ago at this little semi-reunion thing for people related to Voyager crew members. Most of us have been dealing with it in our own way, but for Davy it was an obsession. The reason he hadn't eaten is because he was too busy trying to find out what happened to the ship. And it only got worse when they officially ended the search and declared them missing last week. I didn't know that. I'm sorry, Mark. I know you... He held up a hand. It's all right. It's just... The reason why I'm telling you all this is... Well, I've been thinking about you a lot. And I feel guilty every time I did because of Kath. But then I saw Davy lying on the floor because he couldn't let go of what happened to Voyager, and I don't want to turn into that. I don't think there's any danger of that. She smiled. I've seen you in the dining room. That got a chuckle at him. Good point. Still, I need to get on with my life too, which is why I'm here right now. I was wondering if you were doing anything after work tonight. Well, I had planned a whole night of moping around, wondering when you were going to get up off your ass and ask me out, but that's what I've been doing for the last few months, so it'd be nice to do something different, yeah. Mark let out a bark of laughter. Well, you could have just asked me. Right, and then you would have gotten that aghast look, and then you would have stammered for 5 minutes, and then you'd have thought you'd be betraying Kath, and then you'd hate me for bringing it up. I figured it would be better to wait until you were ready. Mark at once was amazed at her perspicacity and irritated at his own lack of saying. Well then, it's a date. 3 months later, Mark was happier than he'd been in a very long time. No, I know exactly how long. Almost 3 years. Carla was completely different from Kath, and their relationship had also been completely different. With Kath, it was a slow burn. They'd met at a conference, and had been close friends for years before they finally took it to the next level. But with Carla, it all happened at once. The months they'd been together had an intensity, a passion, a joy like nothing he'd ever felt. He loved everything about her. Her smile, her cheekbones, the way she always wore big floppy hats when it was sunny, the way she always rubbed Molly on her tummy whenever she came to the house, the fact that she always put things back in exactly the same place all the time. Mark was more the type to just drop things where he happened to be standing when he was done using it. Her habit of always drinking Rose Hip's iced tea, the way she always put her right index finger to her chin whenever she was thinking about something, the way her mouth formed a near-perfect O whenever he gave her something, the fact that she only still called him Carla whenever she wanted to get his attention, how wonderful she looked in shorts, the way she rolled her eyes whenever he asked a dumb question, and her habit of always sleeping curled up next to him. They went to Beta Z for a combination of work and pleasure. The annual Federation Botanical Association conference was there that year, and they both attended, and both gave presentations and participated in panel discussions, then followed it up with a week's vacation. On their last day, they were having a picnic lunch in the park next to Lake Kataria. She had asked him for another sandwich, and he smiled and reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a small black box. That, she said, isn't a salami sandwich. Your powers of observation remain intact, my love. No, this is not a salami sandwich. I think you'll like this better. She took the box, opened it, and then her mouth formed that O when she saw the diamond ring. Will you marry me? He asked. She rolled her eyes. His heart soared. Upon their return home, there were a dozen or so messages, but the one that caught Mark's eye was the one from Gress, who was having another anniversary gathering shortly, this one back on DS9. Mark found he couldn't bring himself to go. How could he show up there with his new fiancée and face Gress and Davy and Abaya and T'Pel and the Kims and the rest of them, all of whom were still hoping for the return of their loved ones? He never returned Gress's message. I'm going to kill her. When Ramiro entered Mark's office and made that pronouncement, Mark had been absently fiddling with his left ring finger. The wedding ring didn't weigh all that much, but Mark couldn't help but be hyper-aware of its mass. The wedding had been a month and a half ago, and he was still getting used to the idea. Mark didn't even need to ask who her was. It had to be Taisha. What is it this time? She pulled the rug out from under us again. The war effort, she said. Ever since she got that promotion after her pet project was such a success, she's turned into a complete martinet. Mark sighed. You know, Ramiro, there is a war on. Right now people are a lot more concerned with the Dominion, and a lot less concerned with plant hybridization. When Dominion forces took over the Bajoran sector, it started the war that everyone had been fearing for years. It actually compelled Carla and Mark to accelerate their plans, getting married several months sooner than they originally intended. I guess. Ramiro lightly punched the wall of Mark's office. I'm just so sick of it, you know? For years we've been worrying about the Dominion, and now this... It isn't supposed to be like this, is it? What isn't? I don't know, I'm just babbling. Chuckling, Mark said, "That's nothing new." Then his comm beeped. Before Mark could say anything, Ramiro said, "I'll let you take that. Talk to you later." When Ramiro departed, he activated the viewer, only to see Captain Janeway's face. "Mark, you're not going to believe it! They're alive!" Mark blinked. "What are you—" "They found Voyager! Well, sort of. I didn't get all the specifics. Apparently it involves something classified. I swear to you, this war has turned Starfleet crazy. It wasn't like this in Edward's day. Anyway, they got some kind of message from Voyager's emergency medical hologram. Apparently Catherine was able to use some kind of alien communications array to send the hologram through." The phaser drill started in on Mark's stomach again. "Catherine, you mean she's alive?" "Yes, that's what I've been trying to tell you. According to the hologram, they got sent to the Delta Quadrant by some kind of array 4 years ago. They've had some losses, but they've integrated with the Maquis crew they were chasing. They're all working together, trying to get home." Mark shook his head. "She's alive," he muttered. But she was also impossibly far away. The Delta Quadrant was at least 20,000 light years away, possibly more. It would take decades for them to get back to Federation space. That night, when he and Carla got home, there was a more formal message from Starfleet waiting for him. Steeling himself, holding tightly onto Carla's hand, he sat down on the couch. Since proposing to Carla, he had been able to sit on the couch regularly again, and played it. It was from some admiral he didn't know. He told him a lot of what Kath's mother said, plus some more details, including a full list of who survived and who didn't. He was pleased, both for Kath's sake and out there in the Delta Quadrant, as well as that of T'Pel and their children, that Tuvok was among the survivors. Aaron Cavett was not, sadly, nor was Stoddy, nor the entire medical staff, which was why the EMH was in use in the first place. However, Joe Carey, Harry Kim, Tom Paris, and Vorik were among the survivors. So was Samantha Wildman, and to Mark's surprise and glee, Samantha's daughter Naomi. And Gress was the father. She discovered that she was pregnant very soon into their Delta Quadrant sojourn. I guess those trips to that doctor on DS9 did the trick. Kath had also made Chakotay, the Maquis captain she was chasing, her new first officer to replace Cavett, and had indeed integrated the members of Chakotay's cell into her crew. It was a gutsy move, and a risky one, but just the sort of thing Kath would do. The Admiral also stated that Starfleet was going to attempt to use the same alien communications relays that Voyager used to send the EMH to transmit letters from family members back to them. That distressed Mark somewhat. God, he wondered, how do I tell her about Carla? However, there was one piece of news that distressed him even more. One of the names of the casualty list was Lieutenant Commander Alexander Honigsberg, Chief Engineer. "Davy," he muttered. Carla looked at him. "You don't think—" Mark shook his head. "I don't know what to think. But he probably got the same message. Who knows how—" He got up. "We've got to get to Toronto. Make sure he's okay." Without even hesitating, Carla also rose from the couch. "Let's go." Half an hour later, they materialized in the public transporter station closest to Davy's apartment. Hurriedly, Carla barely keeping up with him, he dashed up the stairs and rang the door chime. "Davy!" he called out. "You okay?" The door opened to reveal Davy. He was still pale, still appallingly thin, but he'd shaved this morning, and his eyes were only a little bloodshot. Most impressively, though, he was smiling. "Hi, Mark. I'm glad you could come by." He looked at Mark's wife. "And it's Carla, right? Mark's told me a lot about you. It's good to finally meet you." Mark couldn't believe this. He'd never heard Davy use so many short sentences in all the years they'd known each other. Are you okay, Davy?" He nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm fine. And I have you to thank for it." "Me? What'd I do?" Davy chuckled. "You saved my ass. God, Mark, I was a mess when you got me to the hospital. And honestly, even after that, despite almost dying. But today, when I got that letter from Starfleet, I guess I was finally able to let go. Yeah, Dad's dead, and I do plan on mourning him. I was just talking with my aunt about doing some kind of memorial service, but now I know what happened." He took a long, deep breath. And I think I'm okay with that. He shook his head. Damn. I'm sorry, you guys want to come in? The place is a bit of a mess. That night, they had a very pleasant dinner with Davy at Felinity, where they chatted about his father, and Kath, and Tuvok, and Gress, and any number of other subjects, including Davy's plans for the future, which included re-enlisting in Starfleet as an engineer. When they got back to Davy's apartment, a call from Gress, who was also concerned about Davy, came in. All three of them were able to congratulate Gress both on Samantha's survival and on the birth of their daughter. The Katarian was beside himself with joy. He also said he planned to organize another gathering, but this time on the anniversary of this day, because this was the day that he wanted to commemorate now. Mark, Carla, and Davy all promised to try to attend. Finally, Mark and Carla bid Davy goodnight and returned home. As they entered the living room, having been thoroughly greeted by Molly, Mark said, I need to get in touch with Dina, see how she's doing. It's terrible about Aaron. Later, Carla said bluntly, you have to write a letter to Catherine first. Mark took a long, deep breath of his own. Yeah, I guess I do. It's funny, I never thought I'd have to write a Dear John letter. He sat down on the same couch where he'd learned of Kath's disappearance 4 years ago, and where he'd learned of her survival last night. And he stayed up all night composing the letter. First he told her about Molly and her puppies. She loved that silly dog, and she'd want to know about that. Besides, he preferred to ease into the bad news by starting off with some good. Then he told her about Carla. Then he told her how much he still loved her. Then he signed it and sent it to Starfleet. Then he went on with his life. The end. That is available, again, in Letting Go, which 10th Anniversary Anthology of Voyager, which also has stories by Christopher L. Bennett, Ilsa J. Bick, Robert Greenberger, Heather Jarman, Terry Osborne, Robert T. Jashonek, Jeffrey Lang, Kim Sheard, James Swallow, Jeffrey Thorne, and Kirsten Beyer, which is a name you should recognize from both Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard. Kirsten is a producer on Discovery and also the co-creator and supervising producer of the Picard series. So, and she's got a story in there called Isabo's Shirt, which is quite excellent. Actually, all the stories in here are excellent. There's not a bad one in the bunch. Really, really wonderful collection that deals with a lot of stuff that the show either didn't deal with or couldn't deal with, or just sequels to things or addressing things. There's one story, a Terry Osborne story is called 18 Minutes, which expands on basically a throwaway line in one episode about the Doctor having a family while spending 3 years on a planet when only 18 minutes passed on Voyager. Stuff like that. So, really nifty stuff. You should check it out. I don't know if the print version's available, but the ebook certainly is available from all the usual online book dealers. So feel free to check it out. Please subscribe to this channel so you can be alerted to further readings. Please stay inside and please stay safe. Please check me out online at DeCandido.net. Please support my Patreon at patreon.com/KRAD and all that good stuff. Thank you very much.